Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in our series of spotlight concerts from Ibarak and Baroque. Today, we're going to be focusing on the recorder, which is my instrument. Before we start, just a few things to say. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom for the first time, you might notice that we are muting and turning off your videos. This is nothing personal, it's just that Zoom doesn't really cope with trying to stream live music at the same time as having lots of people watching. So at the end of the concert, I'll ask you if you want to turn your videos on so that we can say hello to each other. But for now, if you could keep them off and if you could keep yourself muted, that would be fabulous, just to help us with the smooth running of things. So on to my instrument, the recorder. I'm going to set the scene by just playing you a little bit of Vivaldi's Flautino Concerto. So some of the recorders you can see creeping into shot here probably don't look very familiar when we think of a recorder. So I thought I'd start by showing you something that maybe does. This is the descant or soprano recorder and the alto or treble recorder. And these are all part of a much bigger family of recorder instruments. Unlike a flute, a saxophone or a clarinet, they don't have a reed. Instead, we blow straight into the top. And this is what makes a recorder a recorder. They have to have a windway that looks like this, which is where the sound comes out. And they have to have a thumb hole, which is what makes us different to maybe folk whistles that also have a windway like this. So as long as there is a windway and a thumb hole, you know that you're looking at a recorder, even if they come in slightly different shapes and sizes. The recorder was an extremely popular instrument during the Baroque era, which runs from about 1600 to 1750, and it's the period of history that our ensemble Ibarak and Baroque mainly plays music from. There was lots of music written for the recorder at this time by some of the biggest composers, J.S. Bach, Purcell, Handel, Telemann, Vivaldi that you've just heard, all wrote for the recorder. And there's so much wonderful music for us from this time. Recorder players, though, throughout history are known for sort of stealing and borrowing other people's repertoire and using one of the many, many recorders from our arsenal to choose different kinds of music to play, maybe violin music or organ music or harpsichord music. So you probably will recognise this theme. It's by Vivaldi. I'll play it for you quickly, and it's originally from a piece for violin. And it's the opening from Autumn, which is one of his Four Seasons concertos. Now, a project for us in Ibarak and Baroque this year has been to turn this violin concerto into a recorder one. And true to recorder players, we always like to have a surprise up our sleeve to make it a bit more recordery, which you can hear with that same theme now. these different shapes and sizes are something that we see less often, even with our group, Ibarak and Baroque, that often uses recorder players. So I thought this would be a really good opportunity for me to quickly take you through all the different sizes of recorders that I've got here and give you a sort of a greater idea of what the recorder family really looks like. So the four most common recorders are the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, just the same as voices, and it'll be these that I'll show you first. The recorder was first really popular in this country during the Tudor times, and King Henry VIII actually had a massive collection of recorders himself. He had 76 recorders, and although I haven't got quite that many, I really do have quite a few to show you today, and I thought I'd use Henry as the inspiration for how I'll show you these recorders. He is sometimes thought to have written Greensleeves, this tune that I'm going to play for you, and you can decide for yourself whether you think he actually wrote that, bearing in mind he'd be likely to chop off your head if you disagreed with him. And I'm going to use this on the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the bass, which I've got up here. And you'll be able to hear the tune as it's passed down through the bigger instruments, what happens to the sound. So I'll start with the soprano and make my way downwards. You probably heard there, what happens to the sound as the instrument gets bigger is it basically gets lower. So by having all of these instruments of different shapes and sizes to choose from, it means that we can play a huge range of notes, even though the recorder itself only has a range of about 2.5 to 3 octaves, depending on the model. The recorders are all related to each other. So here I've got my soprano and my tenor, and basically it's just all maths. The soprano and tenor are both pitched in C. The soprano is exactly 1/2 the size of the tenor. So all they've done is enlarged it by 2 exact times. And it's the same with the treble, the alto, and the bass that you've just heard. The bass is exactly twice the size of the alto, and therefore it makes a sound that's precisely twice as low. The mathematics also works getting smaller. So these are my two smallest recorders. We've got the sopranino, which you can see is exactly half the size of the treble. And I'll play you a little tune on that one later on. But this recorder is the one I'm really excited to be able to give you a close-up of today, but I just bring it a bit closer. This is the Garkline recorder. And you can see it looks a tiny bit different from the other instruments that I've been showing this morning, because it's got a curve in the holes on either side, you can see that. And that's simply because it's so small, it's about 6 inches tall, that my hands are actually bigger than the recorder itself. So all we do is we squeeze our fingers on the side. Now, as we heard, the sound gets deeper when the recorders get longer, so too it gets higher if the recorders are shorter. That's its lowest note, actually. So it's a very high instrument. It's not used very often in solo repertoire. You'd be more likely to hear this in an ensemble setting, or we call that a recorder consort, when we're a group of recorder players playing together. Speaking of which, that's the same place that I'd be likely to use this sort of instrument. So this is the Great Bass recorder. It's exactly 4 times the size or every dimension of the descant recorder that we so often see in schools. And you can see it looks a little different. It's got this bending, purely because if it was a straight blown instrument, I actually wouldn't be tall enough to reach to play it. So by bending it, they've just made it easier for me to blow, and it doesn't affect the sound because it's very, very smooth in there. You can also see, if I hold this up as high as I can, you can also see that there's a lot of key work on this instrument. That is because, if you can see here, my little finger would have to be able to stretch all the way down to these holes at the bottom. And it's the same here, there's a very, very big stretch. It makes a really lovely low sound that we don't often get to show off in a solo setting. So I'd like to play you a quick tune on this one so you can really hear the difference in the tone. This is from Barsanti's set of old Scottish tunes, and it's called The Lass of Patty's Mill. So you can hear that sounds very, very different to the higher instruments that we're used to. But believe it or not, this great bass recorder is actually not the biggest recorder I've got to show you today. Now, alongside my work with Iberacum Baroque, I'm also a full-time member of the recorder consort Palisander, and it's with their kind permission that I'm able to show you the biggest recorder that I have access to. So this recorder, I'm going to have to collect from behind the curtain because it took up the whole shot otherwise. Oh, it's not very glamorous moving it, but this is called the Contrabass Recorder. Now I'm really going to struggle to get this into shot, but I'll do my best. It has the two distinguishing features. Oh, I'm not sure I can show you. There we go, I can. Here, up here is the windway. Remember that was one of the two things that we need to be present to make it a recorder and not a bassoon or something, which I'm often asked if it is. And on the back of the recorder here, we can see an absolutely ginormous thumb hole. So it's definitely a recorder, even though it looks very strange. It's 2 meters tall, just like the other great bass recorder. Look, it's got lots of keywork, and you can't see, but I've got a stand that holds it up for me whilst I'm playing, because otherwise it's simply too heavy. This is an instrument that we believe they had historically, right the way back to the Tudor era, which is kind of impressive to imagine. And you can understand it makes a very low sound. The thing that's so different about this recorder is that I have to have this pipe to carry the air from my mouth all the way up to the top of the instruments and all the way down to the bottom. The reason for the pipe rather than a bend like we saw with the great bass recorder is because even with a bend, I think it would be so far away I wouldn't actually be able to reach to play it. So having this pipe is really the only way that it would be possible for someone of my height to play this 6-foot plus recorder. I think you can imagine the sound it makes is really rather low. It's also actually very quiet. It looks like it's going to make a very big noise, but actually we have to listen quite carefully for that one because it is quite a quiet instrument naturally. Now, all the recorders that I've shown you and that you will have seen me playing on today are made of wood rather than plastic, which we often see nowadays. There's no real difference to the basic design of a plastic recorder compared to a wooden recorder. And basically, after the World War, they realised that mass producing plastic instruments would be a very cost efficient way of allowing young people to start learning music. The first plastic recorders were actually made of Bakelite, and they melted in shop windows under sunlight, which I think gives quite a spooky scene set. But all of my recorders are wooden. I've just got one more kind to show you before I get back to some music. And it's this set of recorders, again lent to me for the video today by Palisander. This is a Renaissance instrument, or a copy of a Renaissance instrument, which if we compare to a more normal looking recorder, this is another tenor recorder, you can see it looks slightly different even though they are recorders of the same size and pitch. So they've just got a simpler one piece of wood design, and the main difference is right at the bottom here, we've got a much bigger hole, so they make a really lovely broad sound. And they look slightly different at the bottom here. We call this the fontanelle. I've previously been asked, was that a speaker to amplify the recorder? No, it's actually just to cover up the keywork here, which isn't nearly as pretty as the rest of it, and it protects it as well. We've got two keys because this recorder is from the Renaissance era, so we're thinking 400, 500 years ago, recorders like these would have been played, and they didn't yet have a decision on whether the recorder should be played this way round or, oh, this feels weird, this way round. So that's why there's a key at the bottom, because it's an authentic replica. There will be a Q&A at the end of this concert, so if you've seen any recorders that you'd like me to show you closer, or you've got any questions about the instruments, the music, how they work, when they were designed, anything like that, if you're watching us on Zoom, you can pop any questions that you've got into the chat box, and I'll try and answer those at the end of the concert. And if you're streaming us on YouTube at the moment, please just leave your questions in the comments, and I'll get to those as well. So back to the music. One of the best things I think about being a recorder player is not only do we have this huge array of instruments, we have a huge array of music too. If you tuned into our concert last week, that I believe is still available on our YouTube page, you will have heard me playing a roughly 700, 800-year-old medieval dance on my recorder. And I was surprised this week when my husband asked me, do you want to watch the new Star Wars series, The Mandalorian? I thought, okay, and we turned it on, and the first noise that you actually hear is a bass recorder. And in fact, it carries on through the whole series. The bass recorder is a really prominent thing on the soundtrack. So there's really a good mixture of very, very old music and very, very new music. But here at Baroque and Baroque, we mainly like to focus on Baroque music written between about 1600 and 1750. We said earlier there was lots of music for the recorder written at that time, and as well as the concerto that you heard earlier and solo pieces and sonatas, it was often used to represent different things in music for the theatre or music in an opera or a play or something like that. So the three things that would most often be represented by a recorder would be a shepherd's pipe. So if the person writing the music wanted to set the scene of somewhere very rural or farmland, something like that, they'd use a recorder as a little pipe. For ghosts, if you want to make a sort of spooky sound, sort of like that, then they might use a recorder for a spooky ghost-like effect. But most commonly is to represent birdsong. Now, the recorder is actually only called a recorder in English. In France, they call it a flûte à bec, which means a beaked flute, referring to this little bit here rather than a flute like this. In Italy, they call it the flauto dolce, which means a sweet flute, which I think sounds really nice. But in English, we call it the recorder. And one theory on why that is from the Old English verb to record, which just meant birdsong. In the 17th and 18th century, they took this rather literally because in London, during the early 1700s, it was the height of fashion to have a pet bird. And they actually published a book called The Bird Fancier's Delight, which had loads of little tunes in for specific birds that you could sit and play your recorder and teach the bird how to sing it in an effort, I think, to outdo your neighbour. So basically your bird would have a much better song than your neighbour's bird, and it was all for the social status. So I've got one of these lovely little tunes to play for you on one of my Sopranino recorders. This tune is for an East Indian nightingale. So you can just imagine somebody 400 years ago sitting down to play this to their nightingale in an effort to get them to sing. They're lovely little tunes, and I think you can really hear the bird sounds coming in there and why the recorder is so often used in music to represent birds. At the end of the Baroque era, there was lots of advancements for other instruments. Pianos suddenly started to take over from harpsichords, flutes turned from wooden flutes into metal flutes, and everything generally became much, much louder and much more chromatically advanced, so they could play lots and lots and lots of notes, basically. Unfortunately, this meant that the recorder, which is naturally limited in its volume by its setup, didn't make the cut. Basically, it wasn't loud enough to keep up with all the other instruments, and so for this reason there's basically no music written for the recorder at the end of the Baroque era, so 1750, right up until the instrument was rediscovered in the early 20th century as part of the early music revival. Nowadays, the recorder is used for lots and lots of things. We were talking about Star Wars earlier. When it was rediscovered in the 1900s, lots of effort was put into learning how they played the recorder during the Baroque era. So, trying to make it stylistically the same. How would they play this Vivaldi? Can we play it in the same way? But in the last sort of 50, 60 years, there's been a massive shift where now composers are really interested in all the sort of cool sound effects that it's possible to make on our instrument that are quite different to lots of other woodwind instruments. So I thought it'd be fun, before we do this Q&A, for me to try sharing with you a piece of contemporary recorded music. This piece is called The Voice of the Crocodile, and it uses some of those slightly strange sounds I was just talking about then. And the composer writes at the top of this piece that he feels it represents what a crocodile's voice might sound like if he was able to speak. So you can think straight away, you're going to realise this is going to be quite weird and a little bit silly. So this is The Voice of the Crocodile, which I'm playing on my tenor recorder. Well, that's a really weird piece to play to just my laptop, but I hope you enjoyed that. So before we do, I look at some of these questions, let me just share with you what the plan is for our concert next week. Next week, we're going to take a slightly different take, and instead of having a live concert like this, we're going to use the opportunity to premiere the first in a series of videos that our ensemble, Ibarak and Baroque, has made in collaboration with Terry Deary, who's the Horrible Histories author. Now, our group's been so lucky over the last few years that Chris, the director, has worked with Terry on a number of projects. And this is the first time we've got anything on video to sort of share with the general public. It's part of a wider series, and it's just the first one. And what it will involve is Terry Deary, the author of Horrible Histories, telling us some of his stories about the Georgian era, which is where a lot of our Baroque music comes from. The theme is going to be all about food and fashion, so I think he's got a lot of pretty funny stories to share. And it will be paired with some of our music that matches the same era of history. So that will be going live on our YouTube and Facebook pages next Friday at 1 p.m, if you'd like to join us for that. And as another notice, you'll know that we have been sharing these concerts over the last few weeks completely free of charge to watch, because we're really keen to keep sharing our music even though we're not currently able to do these concerts in person. If you do feel that you're able to make a small donation to the ensemble, I believe there's a link that's going to be posted in the YouTube comments and in the chat on Zoom, just as a gesture, sort of a ticket price sort of thing, that would go towards supporting our musicians and just securing the future of our ensemble in this very uncertain time. So we've got the Q&A coming now. I'm just having a look on my chat to see if I've got any questions come up on here. Okay, we've got one from Claire. My question is, does it make a difference which wood the recorder is made from? And if so, which is Miriam's favourite wood? It does make a big difference, yes. You'll see lots of my recorders are made of light coloured woods, and they actually make quite a light, bright sort of sound. This is a very new instrument for me, a sopranino. You can see it's a very, very sparkling sound. When I compare that to the darker woods, which I don't have many of, this one is grenadilla with just some boxwoods on the side. This makes a slightly broader, deeper sound. And I really like that, having the contrast between the two. Another question here from Claire says, also, when were recorders first used and what is the earliest known? That's quite a cool question. The earliest known recorder that fits into that bracket we were talking about earlier with a thumb hole and a windway are actually sort of bone pipes that were used in the Iron Age. The first time we've seen the word recorder written down, though, is about the 13th century. So we're not too sure what sort of happened in the interim there, but certainly for the last 700-800 years, recorder has been an active member of the musical family. Natasha has written, hi Natasha, what is your favourite recorder to play? It very much depends on the mood that I'm in. If I'm feeling very excitable, I really like using those little recorders, especially the Garkline recorder that I showed you earlier, just because it's very, very, very sweet and very fun to play. The larger instruments, however, I think probably this tenor is my absolute favourite to play because it makes such a beautiful broad sound. So thank you for your question, Natasha. I think that might be all of our questions today. Yes, it is. So I'm going to finish now with one more piece. It wouldn't make sense to do a spotlight on the recorder itself without including a piece of music by the composer called Jacob van Eyck. Most other musicians and other classical music fans have never heard of this guy. He's not a very well-known composer, but to recorder players, he's like our historical pop star. He had an amazing job where he was employed by Utrecht Cathedral to wander the gardens and sort of improvise or make up lots of variations on the famous tunes of the day. And what happened was, it turned out that this sort of strange guy with his recorder was actually an incredible virtuoso. He was really gifted at the recorder, and he could play remarkably fast and just sort of off the top of his head. And they quickly realised that this needed to be recorded, this music, because it's so special. Unfortunately, Jacob van Eyck was blind, so he wasn't able to write down any of the music himself. And instead, they employed a scribe who basically had the kind of difficult job of following him around the gardens, desperately trying to write out every single note he was playing. And this is an image I'd really like you to keep in your head whilst I'm playing this piece, because I think it was remarkable that he managed to catch all these notes, because there are a lot of them. The tune that I am going to be playing is a set of variations on Wat Zalmen op den Avond doen, which is a Bavarian drinking song, so something they'd sing down the pub. And it will start off very nice and plainly so that you can hear the true melody of that song. And then as the variations develop, it gets faster and faster and faster and faster. So this is by Jacob van Eyck. For this one, I'm using another of my older instruments. This is sort of a post-Renaissance, pre-Baroque recorder. It's pitched in G. There we go. So thank you ever so much, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. It's been fab to show you all about my favourite instrument, the recorder. We've got lots of spotlights coming up on some other instruments. We'll have the trumpet, we'll have the string family coming up in the next couple of weeks. So do keep an eye on our Facebook, Twitter and Instagram pages if you'd like to find a little bit more out about what we're going to be doing next. People who have joined us on Zoom today, if you'd like to turn on your videos, please do feel free to do that now, and we can quickly just see each other, and it will feel a little bit more like a real concert, I think. And we'll look forward to seeing you at our next events. Thank you from me.